doing?
Talked out yet today?
I've done a lot of talking today. I've done a lot of talking today, but sorry for the rude dismissal out of the other room. I often forget to lock the room, and then people, they get the link and they try to, well, let me figure this out. Hop in. It's like, I'm not supposed to be on.
I knew exactly what happened at that moment. I was like, he'll deal with it. He's okay with that.
Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, so here I am. How are you doing? My name's Jim Field. I sent you that one email. That's all I was able to kind of put together. And I appreciate you letting me join in on this circus you've got.
It is a circus. No, I mean, who would have thought that you could just have kind of an open-ended invitation for conversation and have such an interesting group of people self-select and have all of these fascinating conversations, and most of them first-time conversations. It is the coolest thing.
Yeah. It's cool, and you can see the diversity. I can just see the diversity of people that you talk with. It's just crazy and interesting. And, I'd kind of consider myself an anomaly in that sense, but I'm not an anomaly because everybody's an anomaly, right?
Right.
But I do think I think it's more interesting than that because, kind of why I'm here is that there really isn't a venue for this kind of conversation, at least structurally in our culture. And that's noticeable. In fact, when you started doing these conversations, that's what struck me as interesting, was that even in a church culture, there doesn't seem to be this kind of comfortable environment to commune on these questions.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you do. And I really respect that. And it's kind of neat in that sense. And it's kind of why I jumped in too, because, I've been, I'll give you a quick bio. It's one of the things that goes on here. I'm 58, or will be 58 in a couple of weeks. I been married for 30 plus years, have 3 kids, grown adult, doing well, thriving, kind of smart, interesting people, kind of on their own now. Been a church, raised the kids into church, started United Methodist because we had that tradition in our family. 15 years ago or so, we switched to a more evangelical kind of church, just for reasons that aren't very interesting right now. And, have been in a church community for all that time. And I have and I'm a physician, I'm a cardiologist. So I've been practicing here in Idaho. I'm in Boise, Idaho, for 21 years now here. So, blessed life, really. I love my job. My family's solid. Everything is good with me, and I couldn't be more thankful. But I've had a history of moving from a kind of secular youth that was kind of uncomplicated and unworried. Secular, my parents were kind of United Methodist. They went to Albion College. Maybe you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
Back in the 50s. Yeah. But they moved away from the church as they were having us kids, and we really never went to church at all. And my entire, growing up was secular in that sense, and went to kind of liberal arts college, went through the science stuff and ended up getting into medicine. Obviously had an aptitude for that, followed that. That was great. But I also had this side kind of demand on me, or interest to kind of seek out ideas, and have done that ever since in the form of a liberal arts kind of concept, searching out the Western tradition writ large. And yet through all of that, with kind of this, and I'll kind of spell out some of the intensity of my trolling of content that seems similar to what your life has been like, infrequently find a good, calm, charitable environment to have a conversation that works, that And that's crazy that all those years would go by and it's fairly rare.
Yes.
I don't know. That's,
Yes.
So
I just
yeah,
finished
and
a
then
conversation where we just made exactly that same point, that
same
why,
point, yeah.
and that this,
Why is that? Yeah.
and why wouldn't churches be places for this?
Yeah.
Not just for the church people, but for people outside the church.
Yeah. I think that's a real good question. I wouldn't be quite critical in the way that I think your comment maybe implies, because I think about that when I go to church and I have people who are my fellow congregants, and I think, do I want to get in that conversation with them? And I think the answer is no.
Well, yes, but why? Why
Well,
is
I
that?
kind of like you remember Jonathan Pageau. Jonathan Pageau is my, my simpatico. I love that guy. But kind of like his comment about the old Russian lady. Remember that comment?
Yeah.
Old Russian lady. It's like, do I want to, and this is maybe an instinct that I have, do I want to deconstruct my fellow congregants' view of the world or view of the Bible? I really don't want to do that, right?
Yeah.
And so it would be nice if there was some way, maybe in the basement, kind of like you guys do it over there. In the basement, you do this. But anyway, so I don't necessarily think that's bad about the church, but it is interesting about it.
Okay.
Okay. Anyway.
Well, I just wanted to be able to have these conversations.
Yeah.
I've wanted to have these conversations all my life. These conversations are fun.
Yeah. And they're meaningful.
Yeah.
I do have a conversation partner that I really value, and that's my son. He's grown up with me around him and influencing him, and he's taken off on his own in this stuff. And we really do have a good, kind of conversational style together. And that's been really excellent.
Wonderful.
For a long while. And just to show you how much I've trolled in the past, I have teaching company stuff on cassette tape. I even went so far, this is going to sound crazy, but I even went so far as to contact the assistance organizations for the blind back in the 80s to try to get them to sell me books that they would read audio. And of course they wanted me to be blind. Who'd have thunk? But just because I wanted, because you couldn't get stuff there.
Yes, it's true.
And that leads kind of maybe to how I bumped into Jordan Peterson, because I think I'm a real early I think I bumped into him in the 2015 timeframe, maybe even.
Oh, okay.
Because I was kind of trolling for courses on psychology.
Yeah.
And I bumped into the psychology course, I think before a lot of stuff had happened. And I didn't kind of engage it. I just maybe watched 2 or 3 of them and then moved on. And then he did the C16 thing, and I watched that. I said, that's that guy. And then I dropped it immediately because the politics stuff is just not my thing. And I was like, oh, that's the way this guy is. I'm not going there. Yeah. And then something else happened. I don't know if he did some more mythopoetic content before the Bible thing. I don't know what, and I kind of realized he was going to do the Bible thing, and that what's piqued my interest. And then I was on the trail at that point. Oh. That's not too uncommon of a story. It's maybe more your story a little bit.
Yeah, I didn't find him that early, but we have a guy in our meetups who like many of the people who listen to my channel, he worked in IT, and he has certain things that he can do that he just has to do, and he wants to listen to something. So he listened to pretty much every university lecture he can find who put their content on YouTube.
Right. Yeah,
and in 2014 found Peterson and listened to all this stuff.
Wow.
Yeah. And
I found great stuff like that. I mean, I found, I don't know, you know who Hubert Dreyfus is?
No.
He's a philosopher who teaches Heidegger, and he had an entire course all outlined on Heidegger. And I think you can still get this, but he had taped that. This was probably 2010 timeframe, maybe even 2009 timeframe. The iTunes U was just getting started, and there's just all that stuff's out there. There's anything you could.
Oh yeah, I have watched Hubert Dreyfus videos. I have.
Yeah. So where did I want to go with that? What do you want to know here? Let's see. what do I think? Here's what I was thinking. One was why I think Jordan Peterson's interesting. I mean, that's kind of an overworked comment, but I can give you that one. And then move to maybe some sense of some problems I see with him. I mean, I'm a deconstructor in my brain, and I wonder about him in terms of whether he gets some things right, even some core things. Mm-hmm. But let me give it a try here. So Jordan Peterson is, well, I live in this world, I already kind of described it, on the spectrum between a secular world, which I don't really reject, which I participate in and have respected and honored in my upbringing, in the liberal arts sense of that, in the good version of that, not the contemporary version of that, but what I consider to be the good version of that. And then on the other end of that spectrum is kind of a conservative Protestant evangelical Christianity, which is my faith. And so I kind of feel a little bit like a stranger in both lands a bit. Mm-hmm. But I think about, let's say, the biblical text. Uh-oh. And I noticed that if I want to have that conversation, and I choose that on purpose.
No. Because the video paused, but you're back.
Oh, okay. If I have that conversation with a secular person, they might be able to be eked towards getting some underlying message from it, but they've dismissed it before we've even started the conversation.
Yes.
And so that's totally dysfunctional, and you can't get at what might be there in that context. But the sad thing is, I think there's a similar thing going on the other side, on the kind of Protestant conservative evangelical side, because the text seems to appear, even at a theological level, as something that needs to be, that apologetics is the approach, that the worry is, and there seems to be an intrinsic worry, is that it needs to be defended as the main approach to the interpretation. And that then skips over the content as well.
Yes.
And so that's a weird conundrum, right? I mean, the people whose text it is have started to fold into the theology of that text a kind of alienation from the text itself, is my way of thinking about it. And then Jordan Peterson pops up and he just appropriates it and then talks about it. And he has, because of that, probably just through chance, he's created a circumstance where when he talks about it, he doesn't deal with that ideological baggage. He can honor the text and not have to defend it because he's not a defender of it.
Right.
And not have to dismiss it because he's not of the mind to do that. And so then he's able to say, hey, look what's here. And you get to see, and that's my passion about these kinds of things, that mythopoetic notion. And he can stand up then and with his enthusiasm and his charisma and he's just an interesting guy just to look at, when he talks. And he can honor it in a way that I don't know if that resonates.
No, I think that's really good. And I love your observation about what has happened to the text in evangelical circles. There's a built-in defensiveness that has come about with respect to it, and it's I love the way you put it, because it really sort of gives me an inkling into this. I think you said it very well, in that they themselves have lost the text. So there's this little hidden thing. Part of the dirty little secret about, I don't get out and hear a lot of preaching in evangelical churches, but when I do get out, I find they don't pay much attention to the text anyway. A lot of preaching is, they've got their agenda, which is maybe to make you a Christian, according to their little framework of what that means, or to get you to stop doing certain things on a moral spectrum, or to get you to see the world a certain way within a political frame. And that's what the sermon is. Then you've got Bible studies that kind of go along on the fringes, but those can kind of get to be kind of Bible trivia type things, or just
loose, just conversational things.
Yeah. So I think you're right. And so Peterson just comes in a very fresh way. He doesn't have to defend the text, although he gives some reasons why he's fascinated by it, and says, this is what I think it's saying. And it doesn't matter if it relates to any particular tribal warfare that Christians are always doing between each other.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter so much about the other tribal warfare with the celebrity atheist. This is just what I think. And everybody's like, oh, the text.
Right. And so that's where I put him. And I love that about him. And in a weird way, it's almost okay that he's not always correct about his interpretations, because he's honoring it. And that we don't see. Certainly the secular world doesn't honor the text.
Yep.
And so I don't want to over diss the preachers that I've lived with. I mean, they're smart people, and they do lots of application. They talk lots about it, but it seems to be framed, the bookend on one end and the bookend on the other end is the way I think I was describing it. But anyway, so that's what I like about Jordan Peterson. But I do think there's some problems with Jordan Peterson, and maybe I can kind of ask you this question and see what you think. I had a great quote from Maps of Meaning, but then I had lost it right at the moment, so I can't oh, maybe I got it right here. Here it is. This is from somewhere early in Maps of Meaning, and I can't give you the line, but how is it that complex and admirable ancient civilizations could have developed and flourished if they were predicated on nonsense? If a culture survives and grows, does that not indicate in some profound way that the ideas it were based on were valid? If myths were mere superstitious proto-theories, why do they work? Is it actually sensible to argue that persistently successful traditions are based on ideas that are simply wrong, regardless of their utility? And the question I have for you is that middle sentence. If a culture survives and grows, does that not indicate that in some profound way the ideas at its base are valid? Can we buy that? And I tell you right off the top, I don't think we can buy that.
Yeah. And it's interesting that a pragmatist would make that statement, because wouldn't a pragmatist have to say at least some of those ideas, to the degree that they actually were applied in the civilization, were close enough? That is the standard of pragmatism, close enough. And when you say valid, that's a different criteria.
It goes maybe to one question which probably has no answer, and that: what is an archetype, or what is a pattern? I mean, what are we talking about here? But the Egyptian civilization lasted, grew, was stable. I mean, if that was a quintessential stable culture, that was one for multiple thousand years. And it had lots of mythopoetic archetypal stuff that they dressed their culture with. And I'm not sure we admire what the Egyptian culture looks like.
Yeah.
So what is that conundrum that I'm seeing there? How would you talk about that?
It's a fascinating question. And I, was there, so, obviously Egypt flourished because the Nile flooded. And the question then would be how, because if you ask the question, okay, how exactly does mythopoetic, how does mythology function in a civilization? We might argue that mythology functions in the civilization to the degree that it allows community participation to scale. Because it's, okay, so the Nile floods and people figure out irrigation, you can feed a large population, you've already gone through the you've gone through the agricultural revolution, but what Egypt managed to do was here's the question, flip it around. Egypt scaled, so did the Soviet Union. Did the Soviet Union collapse because its premises were invalid? Peterson will certainly say that. Egypt lasted very long, but Egypt did fold under Hittite aggression. It could be that Egypt just didn't have any enemies. Their structure was good enough to at least resist the local people nearby. Contrast that, let's say, with Israel. So you have Egypt, you have the great Mesopotamian empires, and you have Israel. Now we might argue that Israel's mythological structure was superior because it has endured beyond the Mesopotamian and the Egyptian, but that certainly didn't, it didn't help Israel survive Egypt or Mesopotamia on in regular instances. That was a function of geography. So obviously he's making a claim here, but the world is far more complex than that claim.
Right. And what's your longevity criteria? I mean, how many years is enough to say that it's stable? Because that's going to be a problem, right? Because longer, how long? And then what I take from this really is that can't be the criteria for adopting or honoring or recognizing some archetype as valid, or one that you want to embrace, or the one that you want to use as your model for some sort of a lesson, a moral lesson, or a metaphysical lesson. It can't just be the culture itself that embodied it, because you're always going to find that those cultures are flawed in ways that, from your perspective today, you're not going to want to admire. And therefore, the relationship between the archetype, or whatever this thing is that's kind of running at some lower level, the relationship between that and its manifestation in the world, that is to say, its historical reality that you look at, is mysterious. And ultimately, you're going to have to use some other criteria to adjudicate your archetypes. It's not going to be just survival or tried and true. And this is kind of a deep problem with a Darwinian kind of idea, because species emerge, they thrive, and then they go extinct. And the future is always something different than the past. And so, again, I don't necessarily, and the reason this is interesting to me is that it seems so central to Jordan Peterson's kind of philosophical construct, and yet it needs something else. For me, it needs something else. And I don't know that I have the answer to what that something else is, but it needs something else, in my opinion.
Adam from Think Club, he and I had a conversation about World War II, and his assertion was that the Nazis had to lose World War II and the Soviets had to lose World War II because, to take this argument, their mythology was less was less competent than the mythology of the West. The difficulty that you have is, again, exactly what you articulated, that, but the Nazi mythology was sufficient to give it what it did, and the Soviet mythology was sufficient to give it what it did, but they were also in competition with other mythologies. And it also isn't to say that the Nazism won in Germany and communism won in the Soviet Union because it was superior to all of the sub mythologies they were fighting against internally. That you just can't scale this argument up, partly because, again, with many things in the secular world, you lose your guiding stars, as it were, when within your Darwinian perspective, all judgments are dependent upon their time frame. And so you
the
might
perspective, they're
right.
prospectival.
That's right.
Yes.
So you might say that animals of a certain period were enormously successful until they weren't.
That's right. But I'm going to show you my deconstructive instinct here. And I saw that conversation you had concerning World War I and World War II.
Yep.
And I'm going to deconstruct that again because, and this will allow me to bring up one figure that I'm a fan of, and that's TS Eliot, kind of in the same generation as C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And,
yes.
And he was grappling with this question of what did World War I, World War II mean? And for him, what was happening there, you would not have called the Nazis separate from the Western tradition. The problem in that era for him was that was the apotheosis of the Western tradition. Mm-hmm. Because in living it, it was born of that tradition. Mm-hmm. And that was the kind of crisis of that moment, was that the Western tradition itself was kind of self-immolating. And the question for T.S. Eliot was, can we save the tradition in the setting of the tradition itself seeming to show itself as so deeply, corruptible? And so he's seeing, and I think a lot of people in that generation saw this, that things like the Soviet Union, atheist be it or not, and the Nazis, atheist be it or not, they were outgrowths of the Western tradition. They were, and so, and that was their crisis. And I think we still live for sure in the shadow of that crisis, because we don't really have,
I think that's an excellent point. And part of, again, if we want to critique Peterson some more, the Soviet Union, Marx is a product of Judeo-Christian civilization, as are the roots of the Nazi Party. We're all part of the same family. And,
right.
And one, I forget who laid this out. Oh, it was Harari in one of his books. He made the observation that you had, maybe you didn't make this observation. Maybe this is an observation I made after reading him. What you had in the 20th century was a competition between three forms of progressivism. One take of Marxism is that it's a progressivism of class. Another of Nazism is that it's a progressivism of race, and the progressivism of the West is a little bit more market based. So. And it was an internal war between these ideologies that we fought. And so what are some of your go-to resources on T.S. Eliot?
Ooh, good question. And I may not be able to come up with that. I've read a couple or three of his biographies. The sentinel, the kind of central poem is the Four Quartets, which is his later work. He's a guy who came from a Unitarian background and was not a Christian in his youth, and wrote The Wasteland, which is kind of held up as the kind of highest form of modernist poetry, and has a deeply kind of nihilistic core to it, that poem does. And it was kind of adopted by the generation as their voice, and he became the voice of that modernist alienation in the form of some other figures like Ezra Pound. And then he had a conversion. He converted to Anglicanism in his 20s, and he became a elder in the Anglican Church in London for the rest of his life. And in that conversion, and that's worked out in his poetry, he then put that in its highest form for him in this poem called The Four Quartets, which is really a kind of stream of consciousness working out of this problem of the tradition and its impact on the individual. And it's impossible to kind of describe what that poem is all about, but it's a philosophical musing in poetic form. And with, I believe, all of this kind of stuff worked into it in a way that's poetic, not, what's the right word, argumentative, or not logical, or not discursive. It's not a lecture or an argument for some position. It's an evocation of kind of emotions around this stuff. So in terms of, there's Jeremy Irons reads the poems on a relatively recent release. And so you can get that fairly easily. And and a resource, that's a good question. I don't have one of those for you. A resource to explain it,
Yeah, because I know a lot more about Tolkien and Lewis, and I know that Lewis for a long time did not like TS Eliot, and then something changed Lewis's mind at some point. And I'm foggy on that. Better Lewis scholars out there would know that, but he. I
was always interested in whether there was a connection there, because they were in the same place and they were in the same, kind of sphere of ideas.
Right.
T.S. Eliot rubbed a number of people the wrong way because his biography is that he came from America. He came from St. Louis, and he played the English dandy. I mean, he dressed up as an Englishman and he adopted an English accent.
Well, that would annoy Lewis.
There you go. People had to get over that to ultimately be okay with him, because he was, but he lived there since he was 20. And so later he turned into a Londoner at the end of the day, but that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And then he ended up taking this pose, and I think he was this as well, as being the arbiter of the literary age, because he had a magazine that he edited, and he was basically in charge of who got published and who didn't. And he was a literary critic, so he described how he thought everyone should read literature. And certainly a lot of literary figures didn't take to that well. So that might be why that was.
So how did you find T.S. Eliot? What got you onto him?
Well, in my philosophical bent in college, I read the Four Quartets and ended up falling in love with it. And I had a philosophical bent even then, and I ended up gravitating to things that ultimately match up with my Christian faith now. So Kierkegaard was something that I was really fascinated by at the time. And then Nietzsche was always when you're young, Nietzsche can seem like he's interesting. And then T.S. Eliot came out of that. And he's very philosophical. He's very smart. And, and so that attracted me.
So why did you do medicine instead of letters?
Yeah, good question. And I almost did. I majored in English in college, actually, in a weird way. So I went there doing pre-med. I was doing physics, and then I got burned out and realized I hadn't read a book, And so I switched to English, to an English major, which was a total rash decision and created angst in my parents. But ending up, I got the English degree, and then I realized, I can't make any money doing that. And, or I can't get stable. I began to apply for a postgraduate English program, and then faltered, and I needed to get a job. And then I changed my mind, basically. And I'm thankful that I did, because where I'm at is clearly the right place for me, career-wise.
You've enjoyed doing medicine?
Yes, it started out as the idea of matching up my kind of scientific bent, but also my intellectual bent, with a notion of compassion, a notion of coming alongside people and caring for them, and also a kind of interesting, dynamic group of people to work with, always, with all sorts of variety of things, from technology to kind of pure clinical research, and applying that directly to patient care. It's just got basically everything to keep you interested, and it has done that. And I've enjoyed every minute of it, to be honest with you.
Oh, wonderful! That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
What are your thoughts here? What are the other things that interested me here? Do you have any questions while I try to come up with?
So. Why? So you found Peterson pretty early on, because you're a consumer of audible philosophical stuff. here's a fun question. 10 years from now, of course, it's pure speculation. What will be Jordan Peterson's contribution to the decade?
Yeah, that is a good question, because that reminds me of a direction that I was wanting to go in, which I think dovetails into your question pretty well. I think the starting point of Jordan Peterson was the response to the New Atheists and their claim that the commons, the kind of secular commons, had a metaphysical basis that everyone had to adopt in order to create a unified vision. And that their vision was that the secular foundation was reductive materialism and naturalism. And their proposal was that we needed to do away with the transcendent and get on board in seeing the same world as a unified, world consciousness, in order to get rid of these crazy religious types who were doing crazy things. And that didn't wash, partly because the argument that what the guys who flew those planes into those buildings did was reprehensible had already been agreed to by everybody. So the fact that they were making that argument in a very caustic and angry way, kind of gets you a splash initially, but it's like, well, but we all agreed to that. we all agree with that. So that doesn't go anywhere. And then in the back of it was this metaphysical claim. That is to say, before, the secular commons was respecting everybody's individual metaphysical commitments, including transcendent ones. And it was allowing those to exist. I mean, the Puritans didn't come to America to give up their Puritanism.
No, they did not.
Right. So that's the wrong vision of the commons. That is to say that we need to go to Tyson, the guy who did Cosmos, very explicitly says this in that series, that what we need is the common vision. And the source of that common vision is science, is scientism, let's say. Yeah. That's the common vision. That'll unify us. That'll allow us to have conversations together and do good things. And that didn't wash because reductive materialism, naturalism, and a non-transcendent worldview can't be sustained in any kind of way. And so Jordan Peterson stepped into the breach of that. And then all of these metaphysical commitments that have their own version of a transcendent element to them, religious, spiritual, philosophical types, they all said, hey, he's our guy. So what you've got is a kind of a pluralistic group who are standing kind of facing the New Atheists in a certain sense and saying, no, you're wrong about this. And that's a unified sense. So that's the first phase here, that people feel unified around Jordan Peterson. But the question that I have as we move forward is, what are we going to do with the plurality of that group of people who are looking to Jordan Peterson as their voice, as their univocal, as their singular voice? And I don't have an answer to that, but that's something I look for, is what do, not to diss my own religious tradition, but I mean, there is plurality in yes. Protestantism. And we can't offer the thing that the New Atheists were offering, and that's singularity of viewpoint.
Right.
I'm not saying that's a good viewpoint. I'm just saying what do we do with that? I don't know.
Well, that's where I think that's a really helpful observation. And I think it helps answer a question that Jonathan Peugeot was pondering a number of months ago when Peterson was spending all that time talking to Sam Harris, which is why talk to Sam Harris? And I really love how you laid out this vision, which after 9/11, the atheists had this. The problem is, the problem is religion. If we get rid of religion, then we'll all be rational, so on and so forth. The difficulty that they face is in many ways that's simply not going anywhere for many number of reasons. But it's also interesting to note that it was, the spark that launched Jordan Peterson's status rocket was not new atheism, but it was the gender conversation. And he set off a war against what I call progressive liberationism, which was this other vision of, the reason I call it progressive liberationism is that we continue to be liberated from what are imagined to be arbitrary constraints, arbitrary religious and traditional constraints, and that, bit by bit, minorities, we will liberate each minority as they come. So we'll liberate the gays, and we'll liberate the women, we'll liberate the transgenders, and then we'll liberate the black gay transgenders, and, on and on and on as it keeps going down, intersectionality. So, and when you look at, so in a weird way, then suddenly he becomes Sam Harris's ally, because of course Harris wasn't going there with all of that, even though there was some similarity between the new atheists' version of liberation from, superstitious religion. So they had that similarity, but when the progressive liberationists begin to embrace Islam, well, then you have Sam Harris and Ben Affleck on TV going at it. So, but I really like that, what you said here really clarified for me why Sam Harris and the different visions. And then also, I think you articulated it very, very well, how then suddenly you had all not the progressive liberationists, because the media did a hit job on Peterson early on to try to inoculate people from Peterson. Oh, he's not on board with us. He objected against the
pronoun
emerging morality of Bill C-16 and everything that is in keeping with that. So they didn't like him. But then why deal with Sam Harris? Because, and I think you're exactly right. So then one of the things that was amazing was, okay, so not the progressive liberationists, but he's not terrible. He's interesting to the Sam Harris crowd, because as that Mouthy Buddha video made the case of, I think in June or July last year, he's been eating into Sam Harris's fan base. And so Peterson has been making progress on that front. But then your question of really, which is something that I've benefited from, because what my interest is I would like to have conversations with atheists. I would like to have conversations with pantheists. I'd like to have conversations with Christians of different stripes. And interestingly enough, under the banner of Jordan Peterson, all of these people make themselves available and are interested in conversation. So I really love the way you put that, because that kind of showed that to me, why this very interesting mixture of people have been attracted to Peterson, and we get, as people say, this Rorschach dynamic with Peterson.
Right. He is, Node to Network was just, that's just, for me, locks what Jordan Peterson is. He just represents a centerpiece for so many different people, detractors, haters, acolytes of various types. It's incredible what he's got going in terms of a conversation. And but again, you asked this question of what's down the road, and I don't have any idea, but I do.
None of us do, but it's fun to speculate.
But this question of the plurality and what do we do with plurality, or, I asked that question before, and it's kind of like, how do we adjudicate our archetypes, or how do we make judgments about the plurality of descriptions of our experience that are on offer? And I've already said that I don't feel comfortable with a kind of notion of, tried and true or evolutionary fitness. And so, and what I really come to on that is it's the same situation we've always faced. That is to say, if you watch humanity through history, what you're watching is each generation with a kind of ungrounding of their core possibilities, grappling with that fact of that ungrounding and trying to face the uncertainties of their present circumstance as it moves into the future. And you see that's the story of human history, the story of human ideas. This is that grappling, and to look back and say that you're going to find some grounding that you can, it's uncertain for me. So, and then that's going to play out in this conversation, I think, in a way, because people are going to come and take the moment to project their metaphysical commitments and try to defend them.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So when I think, when I've been doing all this thinking about what I call neo-sacramentalism, the question of, well, what is this physical layer? What is this matterverse? What is its function in the scheme of things? It is, as Lewis notes in the book Miracles, it is so easily colonized, and it so easily accommodates different minds' attempts to form her. It almost seems to me that this material layer, this physical layer, is in some ways the medium through which competing idea verses actually come together,
work themselves out.
And plurality continues to be, as a Christian pastor, I see that you see people, they're here in their silo. This is the only world that they've known. All of their systems seem to work, and they're happy in their insularity, of course, until something opens and you realize, oh, there's all these other cultures out there. There's all these other worldviews out there. These other religions. There's so on and so forth. And obviously, we try to organize ourselves in hierarchies of all all things, so that we can function productively in the world. But the pluralities always scramble the hierarchies, and then now we're having to compare, and it's near infinitely complex. So we keep breaking down our hierarchies and constructing new ones.
Yeah, the sacramental is I think I like your emphasis on that in recent weeks, or your gesture at that. And it's my way of thinking about my religious faith is that it's, even though I'm not in a sacramental Christian community, we don't really do that, but I kind of turn it into that. I kind of envision it as that for myself. And because I think that's just a real quick story about my youth. When I was 20, my aunt killed herself, and this is long ago, so it's, distant memory, but I remember it as a very pointed memory, because what happened, she was definitely closer than an acquaintance, but she wasn't the closest of my aunts, and she lived across the country. So it had great impact, but it wasn't like right next door. And a month, I talked to my family about it, my parents, I was at college at the time. And I found later, and this isn't to diss my family, but I found a month later that my two sisters and my parents had flown back to the funeral. And I hadn't even known about that. And now that sounds kind of shocking, but it really isn't. I was not someone who they would have thought of being interested in it, but I really did. And so I'm not dissing them on that as much as I'm reflecting on the experience that I had of that, which was that you can live your life without experiencing it authentically. You cannot experience the life that you're having. And you have to do something to make it authentic, to make it real. And something like a funeral is that. and if my religious faith turns into anything or is anything, I hope it is partly this now. It's a venue for sacramentalizing the real meaningful experiences of my life. And that's how I hope it works, because as I said a minute ago, I that really kind of is like, oh, that's a real deep alienation, to have something happen to you and not have it be,
Yeah.
I don't know, validated or whatever, experience.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that resonates with you, but that's how I see the relationship between our kind of embodied experience, which is the real pattern, in my opinion.
Yes.
And the elevation of that, the sacramentalizing of the immanent, if you will.
Yeah. Well, I like C.S. Lewis's approach in his book Miracles, where he says, his argument is that the incarnation, and he goes from incarnation to resurrection and ascension, that's the central miracle to the Christian story. And what the reason it fits and it's true, he argues, is that you had the rest of the symphony except for a middle portion, or you had the whole book and not the central chapter. And suddenly, once you place it within the entire frame, everything makes sense, and the symphony now works, and the book now and so that unfolds. And so you have the word becoming flesh. And it's been so interesting how of all of Peterson's idea, this holds central, that he takes, from whatever he remembered from being a kid in the United Church of Canada, he remembered to take John 1 and put it into Genesis 1 and say, there's something here that is really essential. And if this gets lost, anything that we've achieved and can be grateful for in terms of how well stuff around us works, it'll fall apart. And you think, well, that's interesting. and so
and he picked up on that. That's very good.
Yeah. And people who listen to him pick up on that. And you want to, and you see it in the fans of Star Wars that dress apart to line up and go to the movie. You see it, a generation ago at the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Oh yeah. I was one of those.
and you begin to say, this is where the story and the matter meet, and this is finally where joy can be found. And I think finally the answer to the question of plurality, because if I were born, no, I wasn't born in another century, and I wasn't born to different parents, and I am here right now, and in this moment, things are real, and I want this to connect up with every other moment and scale out. So,
and it's kind of just completely deconstructing brain of mine, but Vervaeke's meaning crisis, I love that. And actually, I want you to look at the 16, the section, the one that he did recently, number 16.
Yep.
Because he jumps right into the middle of it at that point.
Yep.
And he really does a good job with that. I don't know if you saw it, but I think he really does a good job with it. But now I forgot where I was going with that. But I lost the train there because I went to Vervaeke.
Well, at Vervaeke.
Here it is.
Yeah, okay, go.
That there isn't a meaning crisis. By that I mean, meaning is all over the place. I have lots of meaning. I mean, I'll go with the positive, but I had children, and that is meaning, and it's right there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so we don't have a problem with meaning. What we have a problem is that we naturally alienate ourselves from our meaning. We distance ourselves from that which is right with us. And that So, and that may be a crisis. So I'm picking nits there, but meaning is all over the place. That's
It is. It's littered about all over that. And Peterson is right.
Yeah.
Well, I've got a guy actually canceled his slot.
Oh, did he?
And then you got in, and then yesterday he sent me an email, says, I can do the time. Is my slot still there? I said, no, it isn't.
All right, so you got to bail?
I got to bail. But James, this was so much fun. I will send you this video and let me know if you're willing to.
I really appreciate it, man.
Let me share it.
Too much fun, and I love everything you do, and keep doing it. Hey, just by the way, I'm going to see Jonathan Pajot in 2 weeks. Hopefully he's in Seattle. So hopefully he's going to make it because of his situation. But,
yeah.
I don't know if he will.
Yeah. I to have that kind of thing happen to you turns your whole life upside down.
I feel for him, but he's safe and healthy. So that's all right.
Yeah. All right, James.
All right, my friend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.